Okay, so I'm going to begin by addressing the elephant in the room. We've just heard two excellent talks on a very specific theme, and now, to all appearances, here I come talking about something completely different. But the good news is it's not quite that bad. I mean, look, it's me. It's going to be bad, but it's not that bad, right? So rest easy. This is for two reasons. First of all, Engelbert saw me coming. He tipped me off about the theme of the panel, so I was always going to lean into the theme of gender. But then, and I think more importantly, this is the second point, a funny thing happened on the way to the forum. What I discovered in the course of putting this presentation together is that a feminist structuralist model can be thought of as a sort of nascent general framework for, first of all, integrating several, in my opinion, exciting new developments that bear on the supply side in demand-led growth models, and that at the same time then reflect back on some hoary old debates in the field, specifically the reconciliation of demand and supply in long-run growth, and even the effects of distribution on growth. So that is actually, despite the plain vanilla title, that is actually what I'm going to try to substantiate in the course of 25 plus 2 minutes. Oh, no, okay, sorry. Okay. All right, so we're post-Keynesians, we like a bit of demand, and that's fine, but of course what it means is that our models are frequently little more than moving IS relationships, and there really is a sort of long-standing two long-standing friendly critiques in the literature of that. One is Jan Kragel's famous Hamlet without the prince, bemoaning the lack of money and finance. Of course, there are a lot of people in this room that have done a lot of work on that over the last few decades. My concern is with John Cornwall's argument that the models tend to be Say's law in reverse. They assume that the supply side will always be fully accommodating, and that really isn't such a good idea. So the premise of my talk, or premises, in fact, is that Say's law in reverse is not always appropriate. And in fact, even when it is, it really does serve us to pay attention to the supply side because we get added insights. Now, my original intention was to develop this thinking through a sort of laundry list of essentially unrelated topics. But here's where we get to the kind of learning by doing, and now I'm going to try to develop this idea of a feminist structuralist model as really a sort of general framework for thinking about everything I want to do here. The purpose of the lecture is to motivate interest rather than to go through all of the details. I'm afraid that I have completely broken the no equations rule, so I apologize for that. I'm going to focus on the forest rather than the trees. Engelbert was horrified to see that I have about 147,000 slides. I'm not going to inflict them all on you, but if you sort of see a tree as we go whipping on by that catches your interest, I apologize for not having the time to sort of really focus on it. But hey, you can always buy me a beer after dinner, right? And I might sort of indulge some additional details. Of course, I might just drink the beer and run away, but you're post-Keynesians, you're used to fundamental uncertainty. So, all right. So here's the plan. I'm going to begin with what we really already know, because there's actually quite a bit knocking around implicit in our models. Then I'm going to sort of suggest a number of avenues of recent research that, again, I'm going to try to sort of integrate within the view or the structure of this feminist structuralist model. And then this will lead me to some summary and conclusions, the chief amongst which will be we should all be feminist structuralist macro modelers now. Okay, so where to start? Well, with the sound of music, of course. This would make my mother very happy, but the principle here is to start at the beginning. And for our purposes, what that means is what we already know about the supply side, or at least think we know, and actually that's quite a bit. We already have a go-to theory of production that leads nicely to a statement about potential output growth, And the productivity growth component of that is explained, as far as we're concerned, by go-to theories of technical change. So this is received wisdom, so here hopefully I can pick up a little bit of time and not delay. Our go-to theory of production then takes the Leontief form. That's for good reason. First, it fits in with some of the kind of precepts of post-Keynesian economics generally. The principle of realism. One only need look at Nathan Rosenberg's History of Technology to get a sense of the realism of the Leontief production function. Also, it fits in with the theme of historical time, the idea that techniques don't all exist at a single point in time. They have to be developed over time through processes of technological change and accompanying investment. Now, that function has two solutions to what, from our point of view, would be a level of potential output. The first, the capital-constrained solution, can be associated with a Lewis-type economy in general. The second, the labor-constrained, is perhaps more appropriate for advanced economies. So I'm going to focus on the second of the solutions. And as I do, then, a little bit of arithmetic would lead us immediately to the statement here. Does this work? Can I get the red dot? No. Okay. So, all right. So the potential output growth is the sum of labor productivity growth and the rate of growth of the population. Then that's, of course, Harrod's natural rate of growth, as we know, which, from a post-Keynesian perspective, represents not an attractor, an equilibrium, as it were, but instead a growth ceiling, and something that we should be mindful of in general. The productivity growth component of that potential rate of growth can then be explained either by a Verdun law relating productivity growth to the actual rate of growth of output, and or by borrowing from our classical Marxian friends, induced factor bias technical change, which relates the same variable now to the wage share. And so together, these theories of technical change integrate, of course, some of the major themes that we deal with in post-Keynesian macrodynamics: technical change, growth, and distribution. Okay, so there's quite a lot there already to work with on the supply side, even if we sometimes forget that in our eagerness to talk about demand formation. So then, where to go next? Okay, if that's the starting point, what are all of these new ideas? So at first, I came up with this sort of laundry list of new developments that pertain to the supply side in demand-led growth models. But I want to focus on the ones that are highlighted in red. One of them is an old topic, the notion of reconciling demand and supply in long-run growth. The other three are newer topics. And again, it's the social reproduction of the household topic that will eventually allow me to, exploring that will eventually allow me to develop the idea that a feminist structuralist model is actually something that allows us to pull all of this thinking together coherently. Okay, so let's see how I get on. Why bother, first of all, reconciling aggregate demand and aggregate supply in long-run growth? Well, answer, because of the first Harrod problem. Okay, typically what we end up with is the potential rate of growth on the one hand, and then the actual or equilibrium rate of growth, which in a very reductive fashion here I've suggested is just a function well, think of Z as a vector of structural variables, all of your favorites: animal spirits, some kind of saving rate, a distributional variable, income elasticities, autonomous components of demand. They're all in the pot, right? G equals G of Z, suitably specified, G is increasing in Z. So the first Harrod problem is a general outcome of post-Keynesian models. Now, okay, that's fine, but sometimes it is a problem. Why? Well, because effectively, if, for example, the actual rate of growth exceeds potential, then the rate of employment in a steady state framework is going to be growing steadily, and that's unacceptable in the long run because the rate of employment is a bounded variable. So that's demonstrable. I'm not going to worry about demonstrating it here. There's two solutions. One is to essentially, blame steady state analysis or avoid the problem by insisting on a Lewis-type world. But I think the more compelling approach is actually to seek some kind of reconciliation. So I just want to highlight very briefly here two sort of standing resolutions that exist in the literature. The first is basically to make the demand side adjust to the supply side. So what you see here on the right-hand side of the graph is there's growth increasing in Z. If we have Z star initially, I have a rate of growth G star. On the left-hand side, you'll notice that YP is increasing in G. I'm allowing for some endogeneity of the potential rate of growth to the actual rate of growth via a Verdun law, but it doesn't automatically reconcile the two rates of growth. G star is bigger than YP star, the employment rate starts increasing. Now, if that causes the Z vector to shift to the left, then eventually we get reconciliation at G prime, where we have a steady state with YP equal to G prime. That can come about, for example, a la Pali, if a rising rate of employment causes bottlenecks that then starts to transfer demand into imports, raising the income elasticity of imports, which in an open economy model will cause the actual rate of growth to atrophy. So here the supply side rules the roost. Another approach is to say that the demand side rules the roost. So for any given demand-determined actual rate of growth G star, what's happening now is if G star exceeds YP star, as it does initially, my YP schedule rotates. And one reason why that might happen is if the so-called Verdun coefficient is increasing in the rate of employment. Intuitively, what that means is that rather than thinking that growth at any rate always induces the same amount of technical change and hence productivity growth, that actual relationship becomes stronger if the economy begins from a point where it is tighter. So that imagine a sort of slack economy with a lot of unemployment. The growth rate is relatively high. Well, great. That's not going to get you to go out and do a lot of R&D and all of the things that are associated with Verdun type effects. But you may well do those if the economy gets tighter and you're not simply using the excess of actual growth over potential to work down existing economic slack. That's actually quite an old idea. It goes back to Lamfalussy and the difference between what he called defensive investment at times of slack and enterprise investment when the economy is tight. So this will get demand to rule the roost. So you can work these reconciliations and they're not mutually exclusive. And that's the sort of old existing literature on reconciling demand, or at least a couple of examples of it, of reconciling demand and supply in long-run growth. Okay, so now let's move on to something that in the first instance is completely different. The first of the three new and exciting topics that I want to draw attention to. And this concerns human capital formation in demand-led growth models. So I'm associating this idea principally here with Lima, Carvalho, and Serrar, and then Gustavo Serrar's subsequent PhD thesis. A quick nod to our classical Marxian colleagues. There is a companion literature that I've associated here with a couple of papers by Dutt and Veneziani. In the post-Keynesian framework, what human capital formation does is two things. It augments demand, and it also augments the productive capacity of labor and hence supply. So first of all, then on the supply side, essentially the labor to output ratio in the Leontief function becomes a function of human capital. Okay, the stock of human capital per worker at any point in time. With a little bit of sort of jiggery-pokery and arithmetic, we end up with a new expression for the potential rate of growth that depends on the rate of accumulation of human capital. Meanwhile, the act of investing in human capital creates demand. And the way this literature deals with that is by looking at who is actually demanding human capital and how are they paying for it. So in the original Lima et al. Paper, it's the state providing education through a balanced budget mechanism, and that gives us one kind of investment function. In Serrar's work, it's actually households who are accumulating debt. This is what happens if you go to an expensive private school in the US. You get very interested in tuition fees and accumulating debt to keep yourself in school. So Gustavo reformulates the demand side in terms of the household sector accumulating debt to buy human capital. It's a bit more complicated. Suffice to say that these demand-side differences matter. They direct us to different results and to different policy conclusions. But the real point for my purposes is you've now got a model in which one variable, the accumulation of human capital, is influencing both potential output and the actual rate of growth. It's suggestive of a mechanism that could, in principle, be reconciling those two growth rates, and indeed it can. And the proof of that comes from one of the Serrar extensions here in the second bullet point, where Gustavo actually demonstrates that human capital accumulation provides a channel through which we will eventually get equalization in the steady state of the potential rate of growth and the actual rate of growth, reconciling demand and supply in the long run, which was, of course, the theme of that old literature that I started with. So that's one result. Bear that in mind, set it aside for now, and let's move on to another relatively new theme, related, of course, much more closely to the topic of this session, social reproduction in the household. Now, if I had more time, I'd spend a bit more time on terminology, but the essence of it, as Alyssa has already told us, is the focus here is on human capacities, where human capacities include not just human capital in the narrow, the focus of the previous literature, but also unpaid care in the home. So it's like a kind of two-sector model, but now the other sector is outside the paid market economy. It doesn't crop up in GDP. So the concept of human capacities then includes, it encompasses the idea of human capital. And of course, precisely for all of the reasons that Elisa was talking about, it draws to our attention then that we're now talking about an accumulation process that is innately gendered because of what we know about the division of labor in unpaid work. Okay, so I'm just going to focus here then on the Brownstein and Tavani, and I'm sorry, I've forgotten the other. Thank you, that's it, the third co-author. That's the problem with references that keep coming up of somebody et al., right? So there is a demand side then in this model where total investment is now investment in physical capital plus investment in human capacities. And as we've heard, human capacity investment depends on expected opportunities, which are decreasing in the profit share and increasing in the utilization rate. And an awful lot of the importance in the original paper is on that derivative IHC prime, which depends on caring spirits. One thing that I'll add to what's already been said, but only in passing, is that you can see here that because the responsiveness of IHC is in part to the utilization rate, this model specification affects the size of the accelerator in this model. And as you all know, that's important because, of course, in the post-Baduri-Marglin literature, the size of the accelerator alone has an important effect on the impact of redistribution on growth. So right there's an important insight from this model. Meanwhile, over on the supply side, what we have here is the idea that human capacities then in the unpaid sector are effectively dependent on wages, F of U and M of U, those are female wages and male wages, which are increasing in the rate of utilization, albeit different rates, because the paid labor market is gendered. And then the effect of changes in male and female wages on human capacity production in the home, again, it all goes in the same direction. The derivatives are the same sign, but they're of different size because unpaid care in the home is also gendered. You'll notice that the model is in levels. That's because there's a very sort of clever piece of the analysis of the model, putting it in levels, making it a short-run model, which actually achieves a separation in the first instance of the demand and the supply side. There are no stock effects in the production function of the flows of investment that are actually contributing to the demand side. And at the same time that is actually very clever in the original paper, it's also something, of course, where from the earlier human capital literature, which does actually develop that stock flow integration, and moves into a long-term steady state framework where you can immediately see these literatures could be talking to each other and advising each other. So if we run with this idea of the creation of human capacities in the home, it augments what is then otherwise now a gendered, induced, factor-biased technical change process to influence output per worker. And then going beyond the original article, of course, what you can then do is put that back into the Leontief function, derive the labor-constrained potential level of output, and then with a bit of luck, you could get a dynamic equivalent of that. Now, I say with a bit of luck because here I run out of steam. I can't tell you exactly what this looks like because the specification here of little q dot would actually require a bit more thought because I'm going from a model that is in levels initially and that has implicit functions, and whether we would also want levels that affect levels, meaning that growth rates affect growth rates, that all requires a little bit of work. But you know, one of the great things about this conference is I'm talking to a lot of graduate students. So graduate students, you know, you've got a year. Homework. This is a sort of frontier thing, but I think in principle you can see how it ought to be possible to get there from here, as it were. And so bearing that in mind, we now have a model once again where the accumulation of human capacities now is affecting potential output, and most certainly the actual rate of growth. And recalling the Seurat distinction, we ought once again to be able to get something that potentially could solve the first Harrod problem. Okay, so I'm going to cut through a lot of detail here to then, in the last 5 minutes, emphasize now a third, and again, seemingly unrelated literature. This grows out of the contributions of what I think of as our Western Goodwinians, Kadrina Rader, and actually Daniele Tavani, who's here, of course, is actually the ghost in the machine, because he's part of the et al. Of a number of these papers. He's certainly in on this literature, where what is shown is that technical change can connect distribution to the potential rate of growth. And of course, this is fairly obvious because the potential output growth depends on the rate of productivity growth and hence technical change. And part of our technical change story comes about through the induced factor-biased mechanism, which relates productivity growth to the wage share. And this can give rise to some surprising results in terms of the connection then between distribution and growth. So this diagram I know looks horrible, but essentially if you look at the right-hand side, and if we're at omega star, an initial wage share, I've set it up deliberately so that this model is profit-led. That's by design. You could think, you know, it could be a sort of elaborated in Baddery-Marglin fashion if we wanted to. So that at omega star, we have a profit rate of R star, and initially a growth rate of G star that is equal to the potential rate of growth yp star. So we're in the steady state. Suppose now that there is an increase in the growth rate so that at R star we move up to G prime. So G prime is bigger than yp star. The employment rate starts increasing. What happens next? Well, the answer is, in this model, the wage share starts rising, and that has two effects. First of all, the increase in the wage share reduces the actual rate of growth because by design it's profit-led. However, it also creates induced technical progress, which raises potential output. So in actual fact, what's happening here in the disequilibrium is the potential rate of growth is rising as the actual rate of growth is falling. So we end up at a higher final steady state rate of growth. We go from a profit-led growth rate to a wage-led steady state rate of growth, which is consistent with the sort of Blecker argument, although it wasn't based on this model, that we should expect economies to more likely be wage-led in the longer term rather than the short term. But what does that have to do with the price of eggs in terms of my sort of overarching thesis? Well, one way of interpreting this literature then is that it shows how a change in the profit share affects steady state growth via the actual rate of growth and the potential rate of growth on the supply side. But actually, so too does the feminist structuralist model, and in fact, in spades. Because not only do we have the similar mechanisms that are present in the Rader et al. Paper at work, including effects on physical capital accumulation and the rate of productivity growth. What we now have is separate additional effects working through human capacities accumulation on both the demand side and potentially on the supply side that are gendered as well. So we can think of distribution in broader terms, not only as the functional distribution of income between wages and profits, but in fact also the distribution of income between men and women. So what we have is essentially increased dimensionality of the relationship between distribution and growth, meaning both actual rate of growth and potential rate of growth. 1 minute, so just time to summarize. So on the face of it then, this has been a discussion of 4 essentially unrelated topics. An old topic, the reconciliation of demand and supply in long-run growth, and what I would identify as 3 new, small, but I think relatively important literatures that have developed because they're interested in something in its own right, social reproduction, human capital, or essentially just the relationship between distribution and growth running through the supply side. But what I would argue is that, in fact, in addition to the primary topics of interest, they really all serve a secondary purpose. All of these models do. They relate back to the old theme of aggregate demand, aggregate supply reconciliation, and they do so in ways that draw attention to new ways that distribution can affect growth. And in fact, I would argue that the feminist structuralist model is effectively the mothership here. It can, with some essentially extensions that borrow from the other 2 literatures and take it into the long run, and thereby also incorporate finance considerations, which is something it also abstracts from. It has essentially the breadth to then encompass and even extend the themes that are implicitly developed in the other 2 literatures. So I've got one final word. Graduate students, homework. Don't forget it.